Good evening, and welcome to URI's Long Road to the Vote Suffrage Centennial Lecture Series. This year-long series commemorates the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment. Tonight's lecture, The Queer History of the Suffrage Movement, is the second of 4 exciting programs we have planned this semester. Tonight's presentation will start with a short video about our suffrage series.
History is a central humanities discipline, and the centennial of the 19th Amendment is a critical milestone in American women's and political history.
The history of suffrage in the United States is complex, but we, the people, do have the tools within our power to make the changes that can move us forward.
For history students to be able to see what an important role Rhode Island played in fighting for women's suffrage, I think is going to really influence the way students think about social movements.
Especially with this past election, we've seen what a relevant issue voting rights is. It's definitely refreshing, but also important to listen to actual experts who have been in this field share their expertise.
Reminds us that these issues are not over and that they still need strides to kind of overcome some of the barriers.
As we started our planning, we realized that 2020 was not only the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, granting American women the right to vote, but also the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment, which at least nominally enfranchised Black men, although it took another century for that right to really be realized.
My students had the opportunity to analyze a primary source document from 1916. The document is from Rhode Island, a resolution in favor of women's suffrage, or the Susan B. Anthony Amendment as it was called back then.
And we just kind of wanted to find out, who they were, where they were born, where they were from, what they liked to do, and these women, their stories weren't told, and now they are.
It's important to learn about the suffragists and their motivations and exactly what they were aiming to do.
We hope people will walk away with an appreciation for the importance of the humanities, for interpreting current events and understanding the world we live in.
Good evening, and welcome again to the University of Rhode Island's Long Road to the Vote Suffrage Centennial Lecture Series. I'm delighted to have you here tonight. My name is Katie McIntyre. I'm an assistant professor of Gender and Women's Studies and the associate director of the Honors Program. Tonight, we welcome Professor Wendy Rouse for her lecture, The Queer History of the Suffrage Movement. We will have a question and answer segment after the talk, so please type your questions into chat at any time, and do be sure to like and share this talk on social media. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Annie Russell, Director of the University of Rhode Island's Gender and Sexuality Center, to introduce tonight's speaker.
Good evening. My name is Annie Russell. Thank you so much for that introduction, Katie. We are very excited to be one of the co-speakers of tonight's talk on the Suffrage Centennial Lecture Series, and so excited that Wendy Rouse will be joining us this evening to talk about the history of queer issues in the suffrage movement. As we know, the suffrage movement dealt with much more than just the right to vote, but much more having to deal with inclusion of women in lots of spaces that traditionally had been exclusionary. So I want to tell you a little bit about our speaker this evening. Dr. Wendy Rouse is an associate professor of history at San Jose State University. Rouse has earned her PhD in the United States history at the University of California, Davis, specializing in the history of women and children. Her first book, called Children of Chinatown, Growing Up Chinese American in San Francisco by UNC Press, explored the lives of Chinese American children during the era of Chinese exclusion. Her most recent book, Her Own Hero, The Origins of the Women's Self-Defense Movement by NYU Press, examined the emergence of a women's self-defense movement alongside the first wave of feminism during the Progressive era. Her current research project is titled The Queer History of the Women's Suffrage Movement, Rouse will be sharing some of the findings of her present research with us here today. So I invite you to join me in welcoming Dr. Wendy Rouse.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you for that intro. And welcome, everyone. It's so exciting to get to share some of my research with you. And it's really awesome that I can dial in here from California and be there with you all in Rhode Island and all across the country, people who are listening in. This is a great opportunity to kind of share some of my findings and go through some of that with you and share some of the stories of the queer history of the suffrage movement. Now, the past year, we've spent a lot of time discussing the ratification of the 19th Amendment with the 100th anniversary. And there's been a lot of discussion about the need to kind of refocus our story to move away from just this emphasis on white, upper class or middle class leaders of the suffrage movement, and to really deconstruct that dominant narrative and to start looking at the limits of suffrage, to highlight the racism, the classism within the movement, and to emphasize the importance of Black women, women of color, working class women, and local suffragists in the movement. But I think that one of the things that we really haven't addressed enough is to move away from the cis heteronormative framework and to focus on the ways that suffragists were transgressing normative bounds of gender and sexuality. Because my central thesis is that the suffrage movement was very queer. Now, when I say I'm researching the queer history of the suffrage movement, of course, I mean that I'm talking about individuals who, if they were alive today, would identify as maybe LGBTQ+. And their stories are interesting, they're complex, and they're hugely significant to the larger suffrage history. But when I talk about the queer history of the suffrage movement, I'm also talking about looking at it through a queer lens. And so that means looking at the ways that suffragists defied norms in a number of ways. Looking at how they queered notions of gender and sexuality, but also how they queered concepts of family, of domesticity, and even of death. Now, before I get into the meat of the presentation, I want to be clear about terminology. So during the era under study, during the suffrage era, there was no concept of LGBTQ+, right? Those identities as we know them today did not exist. But queer people have always existed. So I'm going to be using the term queer throughout the presentation as sort of an umbrella term to describe suffragists who were challenging the gender and sexual norms of their day. And if they were alive now, they might embrace the label of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, asexual, aromantic, pansexual, non-binary, gender nonconforming. But those labels weren't available to them during that time period. So I'm going to use queer as that umbrella term. And I think one of the most important points I want to make is that it's really crucial that we acknowledge that there was a queer history of the suffrage movement and that queer suffragists existed. And this may seem obvious to those of you watching, but I think it's an essential point because acknowledging that helps us to take a critical lens and look at the erasure that has occurred of their existence, the erasure of the queer history, or at least the erasure of the queerness in traditional suffrage histories. And I'm going to argue that there was a concerted effort by suffragists themselves, by their descendants, by biographers, to conceal evidence of the queer history of the movement. So that's why the work that we're doing is so important, because we're trying to reconstruct and retell the life histories in order to begin to recover that history of the suffrage movement. And it's complex work. It's not easy. It's very difficult to find evidence of this. And it requires a sort of reading between the lines, looking at the archival silences, to try to come up with the silences that are missing. So as we will discuss as we go through this presentation, queer suffragists were significant players in the movement. Many of them were leaders of major suffrage organizations, and others were outcasts. They were marginalized within the movement. They were pushed to the boundaries of the movement for violating what was considered the norms of respectability. So all of these suffragists, these queer suffragists, had to navigate very carefully their private and their public lives. The first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about the anti-suffrage movement and its impact on suffragists and the way that they presented themselves. The suffrage campaign met with direct opposition from anti-suffragists. And as you know, they feared that the vote would upend existing gender norms, that it would destroy the family. And you can see that in some of the anti-suffrage propaganda. And this postcard is just one example. There's lots of postcards out there, and they're all really interesting to analyze. But what you can see is they imagined that if women won the vote, that we'd live in a world where men were reduced to the role of women. Men would be taking on the household chores. As you can see in this postcard, he's doing the laundry and tending to the baby. And the mother isn't doing any work at all. Why? Because mother's a suffragette. So this idea that suffrage, the vote, would upend existing gender norms really upset anti-suffragists. And they started to decry suffrage and claim that men who supported suffragists were suffragents, that they had been beaten into submission by their overbearing wives and mothers and sisters. And they nicknamed them sissies or mollycoddles. So they really mocked them for supporting suffrage. And anti-suffragists also came up with caricatures for suffragists themselves. They called them mannish women. And the use of these terms like mannish and the framing of suffragists as spinsters or, quote, abnormal women was not just used to mock them, but was also an implication of sexual deviance. So the idea was that suffragists were something other than heterosexual. They might be called asexual or lesbian or bisexual now, but at the time, the term that they would use would be mannish or abnormal or the third sex. So this was really a way of attacking their sexuality and their gender as well. So the leaders of major suffrage organizations responded to these criticisms attacking their femininity by launching these public campaigns to try to combat these negative depictions. And I think it's kind of ironic that they worked so hard to do this because, I mean, they themselves were transgressing the normative bounds of respectable femininity in their day-to-day activities. They were making public speeches, they were marching, and they were picketing and taking to the streets, and really just destroying gender norms as they existed. But still, they were very, very concerned about presentation and appearance. They wanted to present an outward appearance of respectable femininity. So they instituted guidelines about suffragists' appearance, their dress, their behavior, and they promoted through the news media stories about beautiful, young, affluent suffragists. And they positioned wives and mothers, and especially wealthy upper-class white women, prominently in the front of the campaign. They reassured an apprehensive public that granting women the right to vote would not drastically upset the status quo. And if you think about this, the subtext of this publicity campaign was really to promise men that the vote wouldn't turn women against them, that it wouldn't turn women against marriage or against motherhood. So images of babies kind of solidified this theme. So suffragists marching with their babies literally in the parade to show that they were good wives, they were good mothers, and they only wanted the vote to be better wives and better mothers. So it's kind of this propping up of this cis heterosexuality. But this campaign to reconstruct the image of suffragists as these respectable, gender normative, heterosexual women didn't really reflect the reality of the suffrage movement. Because as I've said before, the suffrage movement was very queer. And by casting that image of queerness aside, they marginalized some of the most radical voices in the movement. So I'm just going to start with probably one of the most radical, and that was Dr. Mary Edwards Walker. Now, Dr. Walker had earned quite a reputation for herself. During the Civil War, she served as a surgeon, and so she had been defying gender norms throughout her life. And in the mid-19th century, she took up the issue of dress reform, women's rights, and suffrage. Now, she chose to wear clothing that at the time was labeled as men's clothing, and it made her the target of ridicule. She was in fact arrested several times for walking down the street in men's attire. And when she was arrested, she would often say, "I don't wear men's clothes, I wear my own clothes." So she wasn't willing to conform to the norms of the era, and she was in fact directly challenging them, claiming that women had the right to wear what they please. Now, in the beginning, most of the suffragists and the suffrage movement itself embraced dress reform, But over time, this became a more radical and radical position, especially as they started to worry about their public image and these attacks against their femininity. So Walker came to be viewed increasingly as a radical for continuing to push some of these issues and to challenge the leadership of the suffrage movement. So mainstream suffragists began to try to disassociate themselves from her. And in fact, in January 1873, Susan B. Anthony actually wrote in her diary that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Matilda Jocelyn Gage didn't want Dr. Walker's name mentioned in a report that they were writing. And so they wanted to basically scrub her out of that history. And Anthony objected to this. She thought Walker should be included, but they went ahead and scrubbed her anyway. And years later, they wrote a whole history of the women's suffrage movement to document the movement. They presented it mostly through this lens of white womanhood, but they also tried to conceal the queerness of the movement. And they pretty much wrote Walker out of the story. She's in a little tiny bit of a footnote. So they really tried to do everything they could to erase some of these more radical voices. And 50 years go by, and Walker is still ostracized within the movement. In fact, in 1913, Anna Howard Shaw was president of NASA at the time, and she was supposed to speak alongside Walker at a Senate hearing. And Shaw told Alice Paul, "We don't want our hearing made ridiculous by her presence." Shaw was really concerned that if Walker was there, the media would focus on her clothing, on her statements, and so they didn't want her to be attracting the attention of the press. And of course, that's what happened. Of course, the press is enamored with Walker, and they spent a lot of time describing her masculine clothing rather than reporting on the points that the suffragists wanted to make. But when you look at Anna Howard Shaw and you're thinking about her making these statements, you have to understand a little bit about her own history. Anna Howard Shaw was so insistent on keeping up a respectable public image, in part because she herself had experienced attacks about her mannish clothing throughout her career. Biographer Tricia Franzen has explained that Shaw kept her hair cropped short in her youth and was called Annie Boy in college. But I think as time went by and later in her life, she began to focus on cultivating a more professional image, a more feminine image. And part of this was because she experienced so much criticism for her mannish gender presentation. So she actually grew her hair long and adopted a new fashion style that was really conservative but professional. And she tried as much as possible to avoid that negative attention. But still, even then, she still faced criticism for mannishness. And so this only solidified her philosophy. And she would say, no woman in public life can afford to make herself conspicuous by her dress or her appearance. So she warned that it would not only damage the woman herself and her reputation, but it could damage the whole cause, the suffrage cause. So this approach of, again, downplaying the queerness by a queer woman herself really sacrificed some of the goals of the movement, like dress reform. And it marginalized some of those voices like Dr. Mary Edwards Walker. Now, one of my favorite suffragists is actually in the next generation of suffragists in the early 20th century. And her name was Annie Tinker. And Annie Tinker was an elite socialite, and she refused to conform to gendered notions as well. She acted how she pleased and she dressed how she pleased. And part of this was because of her class privilege, right? She was an upper class, elite white woman. So she had the freedom to kind of do this, and people could write her off as just this eccentric, wealthy woman. But she dressed in a kind of a genderqueer, masculine style, an equestrian outfit and top hat. And she proudly led a cavalry of suffragists on horseback in the New York City suffrage parade in 1912 and 1913. And her appearance elicited much comment from the public and from the press. And of course, they immediately start the old critique about her appearance and calling her mannish. But other suffragists, just kind of said she's just an eccentric socialite and there's nothing to really see here. But Tinker actually used her time in the spotlight to not only advocate for women's rights and for suffrage, but to argue that a woman should be able to dress as she pleased, to pursue the career of her choice, and to serve in military service, even if she wanted to. So she was really pushing back against all of those norms. Another really cool suffragist is Dr. Margaret Chung. And historian Judy Wu has researched Margaret Chung and written a lot about her life, written a book about her life, actually. Dr. Chung was a Chinese-American doctor in San Francisco in the early 20th century. And she wore her hair slicked back. She wore a hat, a men's hat, a tailored suit, and a cane. And she preferred to be called Mike by her friends. And she broke down barriers as not only like one of the first Chinese American physicians, woman physicians, but also for her behavior. I mean, she drank, she gambled, she smoked, she swore. And so she attracted quite a bit of attention for this. Now, she learned to be really savvy throughout her career about how to approach the media. And she would leverage the attention that she received from the press to draw attention to the injustices faced by Chinese American women in a xenophobic and racist society. So she recognized that the fight for women's rights for Chinese American women was not only the right to vote, but also the fight against segregation, the fight against exclusionary immigration laws. And so she really highlighted those issues as well. In addition to gender conventions, suffragists also disrupted normative concepts of heterosexual domesticity. Suffragists queered the norm through their domestic arrangements, their romantic relationships, and the creation of chosen families. So I'm going to highlight Hazel Hunkins here, who's a suffragist from Montana. So shout out to Anya Jabor and her students here who are watching. Here's a Montana suffragist for you. The itinerant nature of suffrage campaigning really facilitated the formation of what I call queer living arrangements. So you have suffragists, right? They're rooming together in small and large groups for short and long periods of time, and they're traveling around the country on behalf of the cause. So they often describe this feeling of total exhilaration that came with a sense of complete freedom. So rather than confining themselves to the domestic sphere and committing the rest of their life to family life, they immersed themselves in this political world with other like-minded women reformers, and they devoted their energy to the cause. So Hazel Hunkins was campaigning for suffrage, and she wrote pretty extensively back to her mother in Montana, and she described everything that she was seeing and doing. But Hazel's mother wasn't too keen on the fact that she was engaged in this suffrage movement. She was even one of the ones who picketed the White House. So her mother was very concerned about what she was doing and her reputation and everything. So her mother wrote to her and said, I really want you to come home and get married and, settle down and live a respectable life. She's like, your reputation here in town is, it's hurting and affecting the family that you're out there in this radical movement and behaving in this unfeminine, unladylike way. And Hunkins wrote back to her mother and she said, if you want me to come home and be a school teacher and marry some dub for money so that I won't be an old maid, okay, I'll do it. But she explained, I really don't want to. I really am living my best life. And so she wrote back to her mom and often described about all the places she was going and all the things she was seeing. She actually said, suffrage has opened the portals to many things, and each portal is going to open still more. She said, I'm going places, I'm meeting people, and I'm doing things that make life interesting. And I think that I'm gaining so much more than I could any other way. And so she kept putting off this idea of marriage and of settling down. And she spent several years actually campaigning for suffrage. She actually talked extensively with a friend of hers. They had a really romantic type of friendship. And they talked about moving away together and living their life and traveling and enjoying life. So she really didn't want to settle down and live that typical life. Eventually, later in her life, she did marry. So she did kind of succumb to heteronormative pressure for marriage, but she imagined, at least for a time, this alternate future, right, while she was in the suffrage movement, and opened her eyes to these other possibilities. And there were other suffragists who just outright rejected heteronormativity, the institution of marriage. They saw it as a vestige of the patriarchy. So another really interesting suffragist is Chicago suffragist Belle Squire. And she very publicly, in an actual article in the newspaper, she expressed her complete refusal to ever marry. She said, I'd rather have a vote than a husband, because if I have a vote, then my position is raised in society, right? I get higher wages, I get more dignity. But if I have a husband, then my position is actually lowered. So her choice not to marry, and many of the suffragists who chose not to marry, were really, this wasn't a radical act. More and more women were doing this, but it was radical for this time period, because anti-suffragists were attacking them. They were saying suffrage was a threat to the family, and suffragists who chose not to marry seemed to be like their worst nightmare, right? That they're actually not having children. They're these old spinsters and they're abnormal and deviant. There's something wrong with them. So Squire's refusal to marry was really standing outside the mainstream. And Squire went even further than just refusing to marry. She actually declared that as an unmarried woman, that she deserved the same respect that married women did. So she insisted that everyone call her Mrs. Squire, because she said that women who are married get the honorific title of Mrs. And she didn't want to be called Ms. Squire anymore, that was kind of embarrassing and demeaning, especially for an older woman. And she called out this double standard in a society that automatically afforded men respect, but only granted women respect if they were married. So that was a really powerful point. Now, other suffragists married and pursued queer romantic and sexual relationships throughout their life, either during their marriage or before or after. So Alice Dunbar Nelson is an example of this. Dunbar Nelson was a Black writer and activist. She worked for the Congressional Union, and she also was a member of the National Association of Colored Women. She advocated for women's rights while fighting against racial discrimination and violence against the Black community. Now, publicly, she highlighted the fact that she was a heterosexual married woman and that she had been previously married to Mr. Paul Lawrence Dunbar. And so she would advertise herself as Mrs. Paul Lawrence Dunbar. And this was even after she had divorced him and he had died. She still continued to go by this name. But privately, she had a number of romantic and sexual relationships with men and with women. So she had divorced her husband and he had passed away, and she continues to be called Mrs. Paul Lawrence Dunbar. But she was no longer married, and she had women and men as lovers. And we actually have her correspondence between her and another one of her lovers named Edwina Cruz. And Edwina wrote to her in 1907, and their letters are pretty passionate. She said, "How your pen picture of a Sunday together drove me wild. To have you snuggle up in my arms would be bliss indescribably. And when you do come back, I'll take you up in my arms and never let you go. I love you, oh, I love you. I love no one else, and I think of no one else." And Edwina gets increasingly more jealous too when Alice develops a relationship with a man there, and when she was studying away at Cornell, and so they have a pretty rocky relationship. Later in the 1920s, Dunbar Nelson kind of outs other Black women in her social circle. She talks about some of the lesbian and bisexual relationships that were occurring among Black suffragists and club women in the 1920s. So Dunbar Nelson really kind of highlights some of these examples of these queer women that lived within, to some extent, the heterosexual norm, but were defying it in their private lives. Dunbar Nelson's public focus on her sexual respectability was, in part, an attempt to thwart criticism away from her private life, because she's fighting sexist and racist constructions of Black women that often stereotype them as sexually deviant. Many suffragists actually queered marriage by forming partnerships known as Boston marriages. And so you've probably heard of examples of these, or you've heard of the term Boston marriages. This term was used to describe a pairing between two women that was a friendship, was a professional partnership, was a creative collaboration, and often these were romances. And I think it's important to note that these Boston marriages represented probably the most explicit challenge to heterosexuality, because women who chose to live with and love women rather than men were a direct challenge to the patriarchy. And scholars have done extensive research on this. They've documented the Boston marriages of many well-known suffragists, and they've talked about these in the scholarly literature. So there's lots of examples of these. Maybe an example you haven't heard about as much is the example of Mary Burrill and Lucy Diggs Slowe. They lived together for over 25 years, and they not only fought for suffrage, they also fought continual battles against racism within the suffrage movement. And they actually called out the National Women's Party and Alice Paul in the 1920s for their continued racism. And beyond suffrage, they, in their own personal lives and their professional lives, They continued to fight for equal wages, for equal rights. Slough was dean of Howard University, so she was pushing for equal rights for women there. And Burrell wrote plays about the violence faced by the Black community, and they were both active in the NAACP to fight for racial justice. Another interesting aspect of the queer history of the suffrage movement is, and I find this probably one of the most fascinating things, is that suffragists were queering the idea of family through their creation of their own chosen families and their extended kinship networks. Suffragists formed households where you'll see sometimes several suffragists living together. There's other suffragists that built extended family or kinship networks. And you'll see suffragists as well creating family by adopting children. So I like to use, there's several examples of this, but let's use Elizabeth Irwin and Catherine Anthony as the example. They were both prominent in the suffrage movement, and they formed a Boston marriage and they lived together. But they adopted children. They actually adopted 3 children. And they even queered, this is one of the coolest things, they even queered heteronormative naming practices by naming one of the daughters after both of them. So they combined their names and they named their daughter Catherine Irwin. So again, this is just another example of the way that queer suffragists were challenging the norm. Now, suffragists also queered death. Let me give you the example here. And again, there's lots I can choose from, but I'm going to talk about Dr. Mary Sperry and Gail Laughlin. Now, they were together for 14 years in a Boston marriage. And it ended suddenly and very tragically when Dr. Sperry died. She died in the influenza epidemic of 1919 at a pretty young age. And when she died, she wrote in her will, this was actually a few years before she died, that her entire property should go to Laughlin. She wanted to care for her partner in the afterlife, so she made sure that her property went to Laughlin. And furthermore, she requested that her physical remains be cared for and interred by Laughlin. And this really upset the Sperry family, especially the Sperry mother, who was also named Mary Sperry. She was Mary Simpson Sperry. She was a prominent leader in the suffrage movement as well. And she was annoyed that this relationship was continuing, and especially about the decision about the will. So she took Laughlin to court, challenged the will, and she starts to imply that Laughlin is a lesbian and therefore cannot be trusted. So she says stuff like she is a mannish woman, she's domineering, she's masculine, right? And she says all this to the court knowing that this would kind of depict Laughlin as an abnormal woman and hopefully kind of take away from her right to claim the property. But she lost in court and Laughlin won. The Sperry's will stood, and the court honored her request that that her property be given to Laughlin and that Laughlin care for her remains. The Sperry family was furious. They inscribed their daughter's name on the family plot in California. They put the phrase "in memoriam," implying that Mary Sperry should be there. She should be resting with the family, not with Laughlin, because Laughlin continued to carry her partner's ashes with her for the rest of her life. And that was really important to her that they be together. So what we can see here is that in an effort to promote this respectable image of the movement, the queer history of the suffrage movement has been obscured, and that some of this information has been concealed, not only by the leaders of the suffrage movement, but by individual suffragists. But we also see this happening with descendants and biographers who are also trying to hide the queerness of their ancestors. In fact, in 1979, a descendant of Gail Laughlin wrote a biography of her. And unfortunately, they only slightly mention Dr. Mary Sperry, and they describe her as just a, quote, close friend of Laughlin. So they don't acknowledge her as a partner at all or her significant role in Laughlin's life. And so you can see that coded language like this really negates the significance of these relationships. Sometimes partners were entirely scrubbed from biographies altogether and you don't even see their name. So uncovering this history is a lot of work. It takes a lot of detective work because there was this effort to sanitize the private lives of suffragists. Sometimes it was their choice, but it contributes to this systematic erasure. So it makes retelling these stories and finding these stories ever more important. And you know what? Sometimes queer suffragists, they reminded us not to forget them. So just to go back here to Gail Laughlin, when Gail Laughlin died in 1952, so this was years later, 30 plus years later after her partner, Mary Sperry, died, she requested that they be interred together in the same grave, side by side, with both of their names etched on a single marker. And this simple brass marker commemorates their life together, their commitment to each other in this world and beyond. And what I found, and this is really fascinating, is they weren't the only ones to do this. There are several other queer suffrage couples buried in this fashion. So this practice of a dual burial reflects one of the ways that they adapted and queered heteronormative death rituals. But more importantly, I think these markers are significant because this is the way that queer suffragists memorialize their love, literally etching them in stone for all of us to see. And I think today they stand as powerful symbols of the enduring power of queer life and queer love. And so that's my presentation overview of some of my research, and I'm happy to take questions now if there are any.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Wendy Rouse, for an outstanding lecture. My students and I will be very excited to read your book next fall. It's so hard to capture this history, and the tools you're giving us about kind of picking up those threads are so important. So thank you. We now begin our question and answer segment with tonight's speaker. Please type questions into chat, and we're going to start. We already have a question. We're going to start with a student question from Omar Lewis.
Hi, my name is Omar Laguerre Lewis. I am a junior theater major, and I was just wondering, because there is a well-documented issue of racism within the suffragette movement, I was just wondering if there was a similar and/or overlap between that experience and that of queer suffrage advocates.
Hey, Omar, thanks for your question. Yeah, that's a great question. And as I said, there's been a ton of work this year and discussion about the racism in the suffrage movement. And I think it's really important to highlight that and to talk about the fact that with the ratification of the 19th Amendment, not all women were granted the right to vote, right? There was still a huge fight for women of color, Black women, Indigenous women to continue, immigrant women to continue to fight for the vote. But I think you bring up an important point about what were the parallels. And in some ways, I think what we see is that Black women and women of color, along with queer women, were marginalized in the mainstream movement. They're pushed out, they're pushed aside. And both groups of individuals had to think about how to balance their public and their private lives and how to navigate or even challenge respectability politics and how to appropriately focus on that in order to get their message across. I think it's important to remember that many of the queer suffragists themselves are these elite white women, and they are perpetuating hierarchies of race and class themselves. So queer women aren't exempt from this, and they should also bear some of the blame for fostering the racism and classism in the movement. And keep in mind, too, that the queer community, it's not a monolith. There are queer women who were resisting the racism in the movement. And remember that men, and they're experiencing multiple levels of oppression. They're experiencing oppression based off their race, off of their gender, and off of their sexuality. So I think it's a complex story about how they negotiated these challenges.
All right, we have a question from the audience, from Melanie Feliz Garcia. What do you think motivated these queers to challenge social norms? Do they all have something in common?
I think that when you're studying their childhood and their youth, a lot of them were challenging norms from the time that they were young. I mean, they were defying notions of how a woman should act or how a woman should dress or behave. Many of them even were challenging, they were experimenting with their own gender identity, and they were thinking about who they were. And so I think that their own experience as a young person who was different, who was standing outside the norm, really is kind of what motivates them in some senses to push hard and to fight for the vote, because the vote to them is more than just political power. It's also a voice. It's also independence, and ability to live their life as they please, to not marry. For many of them, they don't want to get married. They want to pursue a career. They don't want to necessarily commit themselves to these lives. And so this, I think, provides that opportunity. The vote is one path to that.
All right. Up next, we have another student video question from Morgan Soderland.
Hello, my name is Morgan Soderland. I am a current senior at the University of Rhode Island studying criminology and criminal justice. And my question is, what do we know about the feelings and thoughts of the women in the suffrage movement who weren't queer about the women who were? Was it a turn a blind eye situation, or were they overall much more accepting considering the time period?
I think it's complex. Again, I don't think there's a simple answer here. I think some people saw, like we talked about with Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, some people saw these gender nonconforming women as a threat to the movement, as taking the message away from the vote and putting it more on gender expression, and putting it more on dress reform, and not dealing with the vote itself. So I think there were definitely cisgender heterosexual women in the movement who wanted to really push those queer women further aside. I think as long as suffragists were kind of towing the line, queer suffragists, and appearing feminine and respectable, that they really didn't get a lot of pushback from mainstream suffragists in the movement. And I think because these Boston marriages and these couplings between queer women were so common, that I don't think that they were seen as negatively as they were maybe in mainstream society, as long as they towed the line in public.
Great. All right. Next, we have an audience question from Sierra Gray. Hi, Wendy. Thank you. It was a great presentation. I was wondering if you knew the background of the term Boston marriage.
Yeah, I can't remember where it came from exactly, but it's from literature. And it was in a novel, and it referred to the author's the author knew a queer couple and referred to them as being in a Boston marriage, because these were so common in New England for two women to move in together. It was becoming more common, especially in this era where women were increasingly going to college. Upper elite white women were going to college. And then after college, they were sometimes deciding to not get married, maybe pursue a career or go into reform work. And so it was very common in these elite northeastern cities where the women's colleges were, to see these women that were living together in pairs. So he coined the term Boston marriage.
All right. Next, we have another student question from Cynthia Marroquin.
Hi everyone, my name is Cynthia Marroquin and I'm a senior at URI majoring in psychology and gender women's studies. The question I would like to discuss today is, why is the suffrage movement not accepting of segments of the female population that was not deemed mainstream at the time? What made the original feminist movement so unaccepting of the queer community? And how can we implement the involvement with the queer community into the new educational curriculums?
Okay, so I think the first question is a great one, because we talked about that quite a bit, with the idea that if the suffrage movement was very much concerned about getting the ratification of the 19th Amendment, they were afraid that any other issue would detract from that fight. So even issues related to divorce reform or dress reform or violence against women, right? They kind of pushed those issues aside and said, let's focus on getting the right to vote. So you see queer women getting pushed aside in that way. You see these issues related to dress reform and whatnot getting pushed aside. And so I think that that has a lot to do with why they're pushing them off to the side, is because they want to focus on their main message, and they want to get the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And in order to do that, they have to make themselves appear respectable and feminine and charming, right? And promise men that they're not going to turn women against them and whatnot. So they're kind of playing to this middle ground, this more conservative audience. The second part of your question had to do with education. And I think you were asking about why we don't learn about this history as much, or how we can go about learning this history. I think what you see is, especially in the post-World War II era, right, is increasing oppression and homophobia and efforts to suppress homosexuality. And what happens then is that you see the emergence of a queer community, of queer identity, of queer culture, but you also see this huge societal attempt to suppress queer people and their rights. So that gives rise to gay liberation movement, and you see the emergence of the various LGBTQ plus civil rights movements. So it's really only relatively recently that, one, people have come out of the closet, that there was this gay liberation movement with people being out and proud, that there's been more acceptance of LGBTQ plus people in the mainstream. And only recently, states like California have passed laws requiring teachers in K-12 to discuss queer history, to introduce students to these concepts that LGBTQ plus people have existed. And I think that's really important because these queer suffragists that I've been studying, right, they forge a path forward. They're talking about radical change, and they're loud, and they're calling for this change, and they're being pushed aside. They're being marginalized. And so I think that the strategies that they came up with to try to make these changes are really important, but they also had consequences. And that's an important lesson for us today, to think about making sure everyone's voices are heard in the movement, making sure there's room for everyone, and keeping in mind that radical change is possible, but you have to listen to those who are calling for it.
Great. We now have another audience question from my colleague in Gender and Women's Studies, Jody Lisberger. Jody asks, given that Texas controls the content of most social studies and history textbooks, grades 1 through 12, do you suppose these truths will ever enter education? What can be done about that?
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I'm super optimistic that there's going to be significant changes in history education in the next several years, because we're already seeing that. Here in California, the Fair Education Act was passed, requiring K-12 teachers to discuss queer history. And we've been working on that throughout the state and helping educate teachers about this history. And at first there was pushback, but it's going really well for the most part. And teachers are starting to understand this history and starting to teach it, and starting to see the paths to it as well. And I think that it's important for educators to educate themselves first about it. Most of us went to school in a time where this wasn't covered, and it's really only recently that it's even begun to be a part of the curriculum. So educators have to learn about this themselves and start to think about ways that they can include it in the curriculum. In history education, we talk about this idea of windows and mirrors, right? And I think that studying the past, and especially studying the queer past, is really important, because it can provide us with these windows and mirrors and this ability to kind of see ourselves and to see others. And that's why I think it's really important for queer youth, especially today, right? Because they're growing up in a time there's a lot more LGBTQ plus acceptance, but there's still high rates of depression and suicide among queer youth, because we still have a long way to go toward acceptance. So I think it's important that K-12 educators work on this, because studying the queer past can serve as a window. It can help people better understand the history and experiences of LGBTQ plus people. And it can also understand that queer people have always been a part of our history. And for queer youth, this is really important because studying the queer past serves as a mirror, and it helps them see themselves and the people that came before them, and maybe help them feel a little bit less alone in their experiences.
Excellent. Yeah, excellent points. Next, we have another student video question from Rihanna Ellick.
Hi, Professor Rouse. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us tonight. My name is Rihanna Ellick. I'm a senior double major in psychology and gender and women's studies. And my question is that I was wondering if there are any individuals who today we would understand as being transgender who were involved in the suffragette movements. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that was great. So I've been searching for trans suffragists, and I have found one individual. He was a trans man actually in San Jose, California. And he wasn't directly involved in the suffrage movement, but he was in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And he was pretty active in that. In fact, he gave speeches right here in San Jose area. And he was he had a chosen family of suffragists. There was a woman named Dr. Alida Avery, and she was his adopted mother, so to speak. Like, that's what he said, that she really took him in and mentored him. And they lived together for a time. And then when she passed away, because she was much older, he went and lived in Los Angeles and lived as an openly like trans man, right? He was a trans man, but he tried to resume his life because no one knew his story about his transition except here in the Bay Area. So he tried to live his life in Southern California as a cis man, essentially, and they didn't really accept that. Once he was discovered, so to speak, he was actually arrested, and it became this major battle with the police and the courts about his identity. And eventually another suffragist named Clara Foltz, she served as his attorney and tried to defend his right to live as he wanted in court. And so it's a really interesting story. He's not directly tied to suffrage, but he had a suffragist chosen family that were really supportive of him. So it's an interesting story.
All right, we've been getting some great questions from the audience. As a reminder, you can like us on social media and type in comments. And we have a question here from Professor Anya Jabor, University of Montana. My students have been telling me that there is a current discourse that LGBTQ+ people are new, or that queerness is a trend. How does your research help counter this notion?
Yeah, thanks, Anya. I think that's great that they're talking about that, because I think that is the significance of queer history as a whole, right? Is to talk about this long history of queer people and their existence, and that it's not a new trend. It's not this fad that will come and go. Queer people have always been here, and they always will be. And so I think highlighting the queerness, and especially the erasure and why it was erased and how that came to be, and this concern with respectability and everything, helps us understand where we're at now and where we need to go with being able to allow people to live their lives freely and not feel like they have to hide, or that there's a shameful past, right, that we can't be aware of.
All right. Next, we have another question from the audience, the student question from Isandri Garcia. From what I understand, some women chose to wear clothes or act in a way that challenged their current social norms, and others chose to express themselves in a way that would be acceptable for the time. Would you say that the decision for some suffragists to conform to their current social norms in order to push their message for change helped or inhibited the movement?
I think both. I mean, we see that still today, right, with respectability politics. In some ways, it helps the movement because you're packaging your message in such a palatable way that anyone will take and accept it, because you're watering it down. You're saying, all we want is the vote. That's all we want. Instead of saying, well, we want radical change. We want, all these reforms that allow women to dress how they please, or allow women to marry who they please, or to free women from oppression and violence and whatnot. So I think it's it's dangerous to water it down, and it's damaging, especially to the most vulnerable and marginalized members of a group. But it does work, and it did work for the suffragists at the time. But the long-term consequences and the immediate consequences for queer suffragists and suffragists of color and Black suffragists is so damaging that it has to be undone. And years later, we're still working on that. So I think ultimately it's not a great strategy.
All right, Professor Rouse, we're still getting some wonderful audience questions here in chat. Let's bring up the next one from Ann Gass. Do you know anything about Mabel Vernon? She also had a long-term relationship with a woman.
Yeah, she did. And Bertha Lutz, I think, was her partner's name. And they're fascinating. And I haven't focused on Mabel Vernon as much because that relationship actually was later, after the era of suffrage, more in the 1930s. So I haven't focused as much on her in my research. But yeah, she was one of the suffrage couples that was in this kind of Boston marriage. And again, these were very common in the movement.
All right. Next, we have a question from the chat audience. It's from Catherine Workman. What is the difference between the chosen family and Boston marriage?
Okay. So when I talk about chosen family, I could mean their partner, right? But I also mean like beyond that. So like you will have suffragists that will have like two women in a Boston marriage, and maybe they'll adopt a child, or they'll bring in another member of the suffrage community to live with them. There was at least one suffrage couple I know that lived with a third suffragist, and they were all friends and supported each other throughout their life, and even died and cared for each other in sickness. So I think it's these people that are this emotional support network for suffragists because they're not living in these heteronormative family structures. So really, we're talking about beyond their partner, these other families that they form.
All right, let's go to the chat audience for another question. These great questions keep coming. This is wonderful. Lorraine Diaz-Herban. Hi, Dr. Rouse. Did you find similarities between queer suffragists based on region? Boston marriage makes me wonder if there were also queer suffragists in more conservative areas like the South.
Yeah, for sure. I'm sure there were. I have found queer suffragists in many of the states, in the West, in California, in Virginia, in Arizona. So yeah, I think there were suffragists all throughout the United States that were queer, or we would call queer. But again, the majority of the documentation about the suffrage movement is really focused on New England, and especially in New York and Washington. And so a lot of my research has, unfortunately, like the vast majority that I'm looking at are in the New England region, but I do have examples of queer suffragists from other regions.
Great. Now I'm pleased to see that the chair of my Department of Gender and Women's Studies has a question for you. Professor Rosaria Pisa is asking, did queer suffragists advocate for particular concerns to be included in the larger debate about women's rights at the time and soon after most women secured the right to vote?
I think that you got to keep in mind that there's no queer identity at this time, right? There's no sense that we are a group, we are together, we're fighting for one thing, because there's no sense of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender yet. So even though I'm talking about these individuals living these queer lives and having romantic partners of the same sex and whatnot, they're still not an organized movement in the sense that they're all getting together and fighting for one cause. With that said, however, queer women specifically were seeking to be able to live their life free from marriage. They didn't want to have to get married. They didn't want to have to economically depend upon a man for their survival. So a lot of what they're fighting for is not just the vote, right? It's these broader reforms, these economic changes that would allow women to receive equal pay as men, would allow women to enter into the professions, would allow women to get a divorce, would allow women to be able to care and for their loved ones and provide for their loved ones and own property and pass on property. And so I think they're looking at the vote as one step for greater independence that would allow them to live their queer lives.
All right, next we have a YouTube audience question. Melissa Gergel asks, Did any gay men openly support the efforts of lesbian women to gain equality in vote and sexual preference?
Yeah, I think some of the suffragettes for sure were queer men. I have found at least one elite suffrage couple who I think that both of them were queer. So they were married. A man and a woman were married, and she was queer and he was queer. This is Thomas and Helen Hastings. And he supported suffrage mostly with his money. He's very wealthy. So yeah, definitely there were queer men in the movement. I haven't found a ton of them. There's not a lot of research on suffragettes in general. So getting into their queer lives is a little bit more complex even than the suffragists, who are very complex, that I'm working with.
Great. All right. This is going to be our final question from the audience, and it's a Facebook question from student Love Dawn. Thank you for a great presentation. Considering the women's suffragette movement was unfortunately not inclusive of queer individuals, did the queer movement itself also have internal issues with intersectionality, such as the intersection of race and queerness?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they're not recognizing the rights of queer women. They're not recognizing the rights of women of color, of Black women, of Indigenous women, immigrant women. So intersectionality was a constant problem for the suffrage movement. And we've heard stories about the ways that they tried to reach out to working class women, how they would build these coalitions with Black suffragists, but they were segregated and pushed out of the movement. And so I think that this was a constant problem for them. And this notion of intersectionality doesn't exist like it does today, right? But still, they were not able to build the coalitions that they needed to. They weren't able to see beyond the needs of white upper class elite women. And that has been a constant discussion this past year, that we need to look at the shortcomings of the suffrage movement as well as its successes, and to think about what impact that has on our own movements today and how we can be more intersectional in our approaches and be sure that we're meeting the needs of even the most marginalized members of the communities that we're fighting for.
Absolutely. Thank you again, Professor Rouse, for that wonderful lecture. We had some great interactions with the audience. Thank you to our audience. Wonderful comments, great interaction. That was absolutely wonderful. We hope you will join us again in about 3 weeks, Thursday, March the 25th at 7 p.m. We have a panel, Historical Perspectives on Women's Suffrage, Rhode Island and Beyond. And please visit uri.edu/suffrage for more information on this and future events, or you could even watch lectures from this past semester from the fall. And finally, if you are on the University of Rhode Island's campus, please visit the brand new Votes for Women exhibit in the lobby of Carruthers Library. Thank you again to our sponsors for tonight. Thank you to our excellent speaker, Professor Wendy Rouse. Thank you to the audience. Good night, everybody.